This evening we're going to talk about fortitude and temperance. And remember I said that how many cardinal virtues are there? How many remember? How many cardinal virtues? 4. There are 4 cardinal virtues. And you can remember that in terms of the points of the compass. I mean, there are 4 points on the compass. And they are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And again, it's not a matter of indifference as to how we name them or the order in which we name them. Because the virtues are hierarchically ordered, remember? So they are perfections, the virtues are perfections of human capacities, okay, human dispositions, human powers. And the highest of our powers is what? Pardon me? No, of our power. Prudence is the perfection of it. But what's the highest power we have that's perfected by prudence? The intellect. Reason, the intellect. So the perfecting of the intellect is prudence. Okay? And then what's the next highest spiritual power? What separates us from the animals is reason and will. Okay? And so justice is a perfection of the will, so that we will the flourishing of the other. We will that the other person receives what is his or her due. Okay, so but we have to will that. Okay, as I say, sometimes it's difficult to perform a just act. You make an agreement with somebody to cut your lawn, as I said last time, for $25. And he finishes it in half an hour, and you think, good grief, I mean, I'm not going to pay some kid $50 an hour, which is what it'll work out to. So you may begrudgingly pay him the $25, but if you're going to be a just individual, you've got to pay him. You've got to engage your will, deprive yourself of that $25, and give it to the kid that with whom you made an agreement that you would pay him $25 for cutting your grass. Okay, so you see how the will has to be engaged here. We're going to talk this evening about fortitude, which is a perfection of what we call the irascible appetite in man. Now, we have these powers, dispositions. We have the power of the intellect, the power of the will, but we also have appetites or drives or inclinations towards certain goods. Okay? And there's one that the tradition refers to as the irascible appetite. Now, irascible, as I said before, generally doesn't have so nice a connotation to it. You know, you say, he's an irascible old man. If we say he's an irascible old man, that means he's contentious, he's grumpy, he's a little nasty. Well, that's a malformation, if you will, of the irascible appetite. The irascible appetite, ultimately and fundamentally, as all the appetites, is ordered toward the good. Okay? Intellect ordered toward knowledge, to that which is true. Okay? The will, loving that which is good. And then we have this appetite leading us to the good, but it's an appetite which, remember I was saying at the beginning, to talk about the virtues, we're talking about a tough religion, a tough discipline, okay? I mean, irascible appetite is one of the toughest, because it is going to remove any obstacles that stand between us and the attainment of some good. Okay? And it's also going to eliminate evils that stand in the way of our attaining the good. It's sort of within the human psyche and personality. It's sort of like the Terminator, you know. But I mean, what's taken out, you know, it's going to take out that which is evil. Okay? I mean, that's what it's got to terminate. But you got to be kind of tough for that. We have an outline. So in fact, you know, there's in a lot of Catholic societies, there's a custom of naming one's guardian angel. I don't know if you know that, but a lot of Catholics will name their guardian angel so they can develop a more intimate relationship, a more personal relationship with their guardian angel. And when I was teaching at the Pontifical College Josephinum, we had a number of Vietnamese seminarians, and one of my students was an Air Force captain from the South Vietnamese Air Force. And he had been shot down. He was an enemy of a captive, a prisoner of war of the North Vietnamese Communist government on 2 different occasions and escaped 2 different times. And the stories of his escape were just unbelievably harrowing, frightening, what he went through to escape. But I was talking to him one day on the seminary grounds, and I said, you know, there is this custom of naming one's guardian angels in a lot of Catholic cultures. I said, do you do that in Vietnam? And he said, oh yes, we name our guardian angels. And I said, well, what did you name yours? He says, Rambo. Which seemed very appropriate, you know, but so this is sort of the irascible appetite that we're talking about here. We're talking about a courageous disposition to attain the good at virtually any cost, and to eliminate the evils that would keep us from that which is good. Now, I've put on your outline at the top a little quote from St. Thomas, and that is, the praise of fortitude is dependent upon justice. Now remember I said the virtues are ranked. First is prudence, so that we can come to know what reality is, so that we can size up the situation. Once we know what the situation is and know what we have to do in order to attain our own flourishing and the flourishing of others, we engage the will and we act justly, right? And sometimes it's tough to act justly, and that's when we engage this virtue of fortitude. Okay? Because the praise of fortitude is dependent upon justice. You can do something courageous, at least it looks courageous, it looks brave, but if it's not serving the end of justice, it's not a virtue. It's not true bravery. It's not true fortitude. Now, Joseph Pieper, one of my favorite philosophers, you've heard me mention him before. He died 7 years ago at the age of 93. This year is his 100th birthday. And again, we have some copies of this book, The Four Cardinal Virtues. He wrote treatises on these various cardinal virtues, and then he wrote treatises on the 3 theological virtues, and it took him a whole lifetime to write these treatises, which were then gathered into a book. The first virtue about which he wrote wasn't prudence, actually, it was fortitude. It was a little tract that he published at the beginning of the Second World War on fortitude. Well, the National Socialists thought, because he was already a popular speaker and writer, they thought, boy, this will serve well our troops. So they bought up a number of copies of this, and they were passing them out to the troops to encourage them to be courageous in battle. And of course, once they began truly reading what Pieper had to say, the Nazi government withdrew all the books, because what the Nazis had embarked upon were actions of profound injustice. Right? And so the Pieper is saying here that, quoting St. Thomas, fortitude is dependent upon justice. So if injustices are being perpetrated, these men are not truly courageous, they're not truly brave. Okay? So all of a sudden, what the Nazis thought would serve their purposes, they saw that it was beginning to undermine their desire to send the Übermenschen, the supermen, into battle against the Untermenschen, the subhuman populations of Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, and particularly the Jews. But what Pieper had written about fortitude would not have permitted that to happen. Okay? So if you ever read his book, just keep that in mind, that any author always writes within some historical, concrete, existential situation. And that, in a sense, launched Pieper's writing career. But he points out in the book, and the tradition shows us, that as this appetite is directed toward overcoming or eliminating evil, it requires a readiness to die, a readiness to fall in battle. In fact, it requires an acknowledgement of our vulnerability. Okay? I mean, if we weren't vulnerable, we really wouldn't be courageous. Because in the face of our vulnerability, we have to stand up to the threat which may be coming from overpowering odds. So if there were ever a confrontation between John Haas and Arnold Schwarzenegger, I mean, in that confrontation, who just from the get-go is going to be the more virtuous? I mean, just by virtue of my vulnerability over against Arnold Schwarzenegger, of course, again, it's just, we're assuming that we're both thinking we're at least acting justly. But there is no virtue unless there is a vulnerability, a readiness to die even, a readiness to fall in battle for that which we know and believe to be what is true and what is good and what is right. Again, a characteristic of this virtue that didn't make it ultimately so comfortable for the Nazi leadership in Pieper's day. Now, I haven't mentioned before, but again, the tradition talks about virtues as falling between two extremes, right? You've probably all heard this in your philosophy classes. You've all heard the expression, the golden mean, right? That means we avoid excess on the one hand, we avoid defect on the other hand. For a man to be, for example, generous, he has to avoid the excess, for example, of giving away too much so that he may harm himself and his own position and his own family. And then on the other hand, he has to avoid being too stingy. So one is a defect of excess, the other is a defect of insufficiency, if you will. Defect and excess. And you have to find the golden mean. There was a rather well-known for a while, everybody has their 7 minutes of fame or something like that. But a very, very interesting fellow owned the apartment building just 2 doors up. His name is Zell Kravinsky. And I got to know him rather well because, the apartment building up here was just a brood of vipers, and it was an awful place. All kinds of, I won't mention this because it was actually being taped. But there were students from a certain university that were living there that weren't exactly living virtuous lives. So we were having to contend with that and trying to find the owner of the building. And I finally found out that it was this Zell Kravinsky, a fascinating man who had been a professor of Renaissance literature at the University of Pennsylvania, and then started buying up little properties to get a little additional income with his growing family, and wound up being a multimillionaire with property spread all over the United States. Fascinating guy. But I got to know him rather well, had dinner with him and his wife, who's a psychiatrist. And then I read in the paper one day about, I actually knew that he was giving away his fortune to various causes. And they were the causes that nobody else would give money to. So he gave away literally millions of dollars. I mean, virtually he gave his whole fortune away. And this is very admirable. I told him I found it admirable. And then I read in the paper that he had given one of his kidneys away to a poor black woman who might otherwise not have been able to have been saved by a kidney. So, I mean, I wrote him a little email and I said, Mazel tov, congratulations, Jewish fellow. And I thought this was incredibly generous. Well, then he was interviewed in the New York Times, and he said, well, if I could find somebody that was dying and had a cure for cancer, I'd give him my other kidney. So I wrote him, I said, wait a minute, Zell, this is excess here, I mean, this isn't, you're killing yourself, this isn't truly virtuous behavior. I mean, you've gone over the mark here, So you have to find the golden mean. That's the characteristic of a virtue. I wouldn't have said his name and so forth, but this was all quite public. He was interviewed on National Public Radio, and he said, well, they always say you have to give till it hurts. He said, but this wasn't what I had in mind. That was right after he had his kidney removed. He was a great guy, but he just, you got to keep it in balance. So this virtue is also going to require avoiding two faults. Okay? That of excess, which is which would be violent anger. Okay, this would be when I mentioned you've got this disposition to remove obstacles. Well, if you're not reasonable in your approach, okay, this is unjustifiable anger. This is unreasonable anger. Violence. You see, coercion can be legitimate. Coercion would be the reasonable application of force toward a good end. But violence, by definition, is something that's unreasonable and unjustifiable. So that's the most striking defect of this particular appetite. It's that of excess. I remember the Dominicans are great followers of St. Thomas Aquinas, who expounded beautifully on the virtues. I had this German professor, Dominican professor at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, and he was talking about this actually. And he says, when I was a teacher in a boys' high school, he said, and they misbehaved. He said, you couldn't allow yourself to become angry. This wasn't virtuous, but you had to discipline them. So I had a mark on the floor, and I would make them come up and put their toes on the mark, and I would take my left hand and place it against the young man's cheek, and then I'd take my right hand and slap him across the face. And he said, I used my one hand to steady the head so I wouldn't hurt him. This is the old school German discipline. But you could see it was reasoned, it was reasonable, it was thought through, and it was kept within bounds. These days, of course, you can't get away with that, and I'm not advocating this, but I mean, this was a man that was reasonable in his application of force toward a good end. There is also the related fault of cowardice, of course, and this is the fear of overcoming evil, that we think we might not be able to overcome it, and so we turn tail and run. This is a wonderful quote from Pieper in his book, page 126. He says, fortitude presupposes, in a certain sense, that man is afraid of evil. Its essence lies not in knowing no fear, but in not allowing oneself to be forced into evil by fear, or to be kept by fear from the realization of the good. Okay? So it's not that the courageous man is not afraid, okay? But his fear does not cripple him. The fear doesn't keep him from attaining the good. Okay? Or a lot of people will fall into some kind of sin or another out of fear. Okay? Because this is why, the Holy Father, when he was first elected Pope and at the inaugural Mass, I don't know, some of you are far too young, but he, when he celebrated the public Mass outdoors, and then he went around the platform on which the altar had been built, and he said to the world, do not be afraid. Remember, do not be afraid. You don't have to fear Jesus Christ. Open your doors to him, open the windows. But nothing probably leads us into sin any more than does fear of loneliness. Okay, and so you become too intimate with someone because you want to avoid the loneliness. A young woman becomes pregnant out of wedlock. She's afraid of the shame that she might have to face, and so she's tempted to abort the baby, kill the baby that she's conceived. Fear, okay? And again, it's not that there's no fear. It's that we can't allow fear to keep us from attaining that which is good, can't keep us from eliminating the evils which keep us from that which is good. And another related fault is that of despondency or hopelessness. I mean, we just don't think we're going to be able to pull it off, and so we don't act. So the function of this appetite, I mean, it's built into us. Remember, when I talk about these appetites, the appetite for knowledge, okay, the appetite for the good, the appetite, the disposition that has us overcoming obstacles to attain the good. These are built into us. Okay, they're just, we don't choose them. They're part of what we are. But we have to form and shape and steel them, and that is what the virtue is. Okay, by repetitious acts, by courageous acts performed over and over again, we become courageous. Okay? So the function of this appetite that God's built into us is to take on difficult tasks in order to obtain a good. I said before, it's like the mother bear who sees her cubs threatened, and you don't want to get in the way of an aroused mother bear. I'm married to one. If any one of her cubs is threatened, you're going to get out of the way. It's just no question about it. My one daughter, Claire, was driving someplace, but her daughter was in the back seat, in the car seat, and she started choking on something. So obviously she was very frightened. So she pulled over and she got out of the chair and got out of the car, ran back to the back seat, and a police car came up. And these two policemen came out and said, "Get out of here, lady! You can't stop your car here. You're not allowed to park here." And she turned on them and she said, "My baby's choking!" And they went, sorry, lady. They backed off. But I mean, this is what a mother does, when she sees the good of her child threatened. You're not going to get in her way, And she pretty quickly elicited the support of the police, too, to help herself out of this difficult situation. But again, it's built into us, But if we act on it in a good way, it becomes a virtue. And courage is also required, not just in those kind of obvious situations, but also, for example, in refusing a sensual delight, okay, that might be very subtle, nobody else around, it takes courage to say no sometimes, I mean, real courage, because, well, who's going to know? And it looks so good, and it seems that we're depriving ourselves of something, and we don't like to deprive ourselves of things. Again, this is why these virtues are hierarchically ordered. When we get to temperance, we see we already have to be prudent, just, and courageous in order to lead a truly temperate and virtuous life. Now, another characteristic of this virtue is that it is directed toward a difficult good. Okay, I mean, it's difficult to attain, but it's not impossible to obtain. And there's also another element here with this virtue, and that is there are certain circumstances which are beyond our control. For example, you can say, in terms of, let's say, there's Saint Jose Maria Escriva talks about the heroic moment. Now, this you've got some control over, but do you have any idea what his heroic moment is? It's when the alarm clock goes off that you immediately leap out of bed. Okay? I mean, that you don't roll over, you don't turn it off, you don't pull the covers over your head. And it requires some heroism, as we all know. I mean, there's some mornings you just don't want to do that, but you've got to engage the will, you've got to be courageous, you've got to throw off the covers, and you're out of bed. Okay? And we've got a good bit of control over that action. But if we say, you're heading off to work in the morning and you read that there's an accident on the Schuylkill Parkway and you say, I'm going to do everything I can to get to work on time. You call your boss on the phone, but there's certain things beyond your control. Okay? So I mean, indeed, even getting up at when the alarm goes off in the morning can sometimes involve certain elements that are outside our control. But but usually it involves circumstances outside our control, and that's why we have to engage our will and overcome those circumstances, because we don't have control over them. Also, it's directed invariably towards some kind of imminent evil or danger, but it helps to order both hope and daring. Okay, if one is in a hopeless situation, for example, it may be that one ought not to act at all. I mean, for example, when the church reflects on whether or not one ought to go to war, even a just war, I mean, let's say even a defensive war, there has to be some hope. That means a well-grounded anticipation that we can be successful. Otherwise, we ought not to do it, because then it's futile action, and it's going to lead to loss of lives and carnage and suffering. And if there's no hope of winning, then this is a pointless exercise, and it's not a virtuous thing to do. Okay? So this is why there has to be hope that we can attain the good that we are ordered toward, and the daring has to be subordinated to that. Because if there is hope, then we're ready to be daring and courageous in terms of going after the good that we hope to attain. But do you see how these are all ordered, though? Because we can't assess the situation, we can't size up the risks unless we have the virtue of prudence. Yeah. And then once we've assessed the risks and we see that we have a right, let's say, to the protection of our homeland, and of our homes and of our families, we're acting in accord with the virtue of justice. Okay? Now we can be courageous and act on it. Now there are two aspects of the virtue of fortitude or bravery, which the philosophers will refer to as integral parts, which means they're an essential part of the virtue. You're not going to have the virtue unless you've got these two aspects. One is the attack, okay, to overcome the obstacle, and then sustaining the attack and enduring. Now, we also have to see here that we're talking about action here, right? I mean, clearly, this is an action virtue. All the virtues are action-oriented, but this one especially so, because you can see, the guy going in with a sword, or the gal Joan of Arc, going in with a sword to achieve some good. But when we look at the philosophy of metaphysics, the philosophical discipline of metaphysics, we see that there can't be an actio without a passio without an actio. In other words, action and passion are two parts of this one action. So that when we talk about the passion of our Lord Jesus Christ, for example, we are talking about Jesus being acted upon, aren't we? In other words, there's a passivity there. The passion comes from the same root as passivity. So Jesus endures, even the language that we use, endures the passion. He undergoes the passion. And I don't know if you saw it, but Diane Sawyer interviewed Mel Gibson, and she had to explain for this sated, secularist, hedonistic society in which we live that the passion of Jesus was referring to his suffering, not his lusting. I mean, that's how bad the world is in which we live. But you've got Johann Sebastian Bach's great, St. Matthew's Passion, for example. We're talking about his description of our Lord's suffering. And it's interesting too that even if you talk about lust, right? Let's talk about lust for a minute, and see how it links in with passion. What happens with lust is that we don't have control over what's happening to us. I mean, that's the whole point. We're acted upon. You see, the young man sees a beautiful, scantily clad young woman on the Jersey Shore. What happens? Certain things happen physiologically within him without any reflection on his part at all. He doesn't do a syllogism in his mind and say, "Oh, let's see, that's a female within the human species, and females are ordered toward the engendering of children, and one of the reasons I perceive her as being attractive is so that I might be drawn toward her, so that I might eventually..." No. We know, bingo. I mean, there's a physiological reaction. He's acted upon, okay? So that's where you could see there'd be a similarity between the passion as is generally understood in our sated hedonistic society and passion as it is traditionally understood in terms of what our Lord endured. I have two quotes here from Pieper, I think. Let me look them up. Well, this isn't the quote I thought, but it's a good quote before I go on. Oh, I see. The problem is the lighting in here. I read the wrong page number. But God took me to this one, so I'll throw it out anyway, because St. Thomas writes, quoted here by Pieper, "In overcoming danger, fortitude seeks not danger itself." And there are those out there, that daredevils, right? I mean, they get the thrill from the danger itself, the adrenaline rush, That's not truly courageous. In overcoming danger, fortitude seeks not danger itself, but the realization of a rational good. See, again, how it's ordered toward the good. That's St. Thomas. And again, to take death upon oneself is not in itself praiseworthy, but solely because of its subordination to good. In other words, if we took death upon ourselves, if it were praiseworthy to take death upon ourselves, would be what? Would be suicidal, right? But we're willing to, and this takes me into the point I was making, we're willing to endure death, to suffer death, if it is subordinated to a good. And Pieper writes here, if fortitude is a perfection, then how can enduring be its essential act? And we see that's, I had here in the notes that enduring the attack is part of the virtue of prudence. Remember, too, we're going to answer that question in a second here, but remember that a virtue is attained by repetitious actions of a certain kind, of a kind that strengthens us, and then it becomes a habitus, it becomes a habit, it becomes second nature, and a good habit is that's what a virtue is, by definition. A virtue is a good habit, a vice is a bad habit, and the way we get virtues is by performing good deeds over and over and over again. If we talk about our Lord's death on Calvary as being courageous, as being meritorious, as being virtuous, how can it be? St. Thomas asks this question. How can Jesus be said to be acting virtuously when he's not acting at all? Right? He's nailed to the cross. He can't even move. What good actions is he performing? What good deeds is he doing? And St. Thomas answers that out of the tradition and says, yes, Jesus is being acted upon, the passio, the passivity. But interiorly, his soul, his mind, his will is clinging to the good. He will not forsake his Father. He's come to do the Father's will. He will endure anything rather than not do his Father's will. So we don't see that externally as an act, but this is the spiritual act, if you will, that Jesus is performing even as he is hanging on the cross on Calvary. And it's from that we see him as being the most virtuous, the most courageous of any human being that has ever lived. And of course, he's God himself. The lighting here isn't. I've got some of my notes here in pencil, and I'm getting old. That's another thing. Oh yes, that's just what I told you about. What are called the potential parts of the virtue of fortitude are the following. You see what I was talking about with regard to passio and actio, right? We've got no question. We see that. Potential parts of fortitude are those that just simply within themselves, in and of themselves, by themselves, aren't constitutive of this virtue, but which share in it, okay? And the principle of these is bravery in the face of death, but again, for the sake of some good. You all know who Thomas More was. He was, the Chancellor of England. He was a great attorney, a confidant of the king. And when Henry VIII severed England's ties with the papacy and declared himself the head of the Church of England, virtually all the bishops capitulated. So what else is new? I shouldn't say that. I take that back. We'll have to clip that out of the... Anyway. Virtually all... John Fisher, was the only bishop that refused to capitulate. And Thomas More refused to capitulate. And his holdings were confiscated. He was taken off the prison. And as you all know, he was finally executed by Henry VIII because he refused to acknowledge Henry as the head of the church. Well, I was reading an article about 20 years ago about the secular government of England was erecting a statue to Thomas More in one of its public squares. And they had in attendance the whole spectrum of various religious leaders in England, including bishops of the Church of England. It was very curious that they would be, erecting a statue to this man because it was precisely because he refused to accept the legitimacy of the English Church that he was killed. But you thought, well, how are they going to use Thomas More as a great example to be held up to the British population, which is secularized and Protestant? Well, they chiseled on the base of his statue, Thomas More, a martyr for conscience. In other words, he followed his conscience, okay? And this is why he was held up as worthy of emulation. So that anybody that was following their conscience, no matter what was leading them to do, could always look to Thomas More. But of course, that's nonsense. Thomas More was a martyr for Jesus Christ. He was a martyr to the Catholic Church. He died not giving witness to some abstract thing known as conscience, I doubt he would have given his head for that, but he would not acknowledge any other church as being the Church of Jesus Christ other than the Catholic Church. So that's the result. That was the good, to which he was clinging, and that led to his martyrdom. And he was therefore able to manifest tremendous bravery in the face of his impending death, and even at the very moment of his death. And there are what are called secondary parts of this virtue as well, that we can see also in Thomas More. Confidence. He was confident of his situation. He had no doubts, and he was willing to cling to the good of the true faith, even in the face of certain death. And there was a wonderful greatness of soul or spirit about Thomas More, because if any of you have read stories of his life, he quipped and told jokes even standing on the scaffold. He was making jokes and saying that he looked forward to those present meeting him one day merrily in heaven, and he prayed for his execution. In those days too, you had to, it cost some money to carry out a trial and find somebody guilty and execute them. So it was required in those days that the one who was being executed had to give a coin to the executioner, the man who was beheading him. This was his payment for doing this good deed. And Thomas More, obliged and did his duty and lost his head, and now reigns with our Lord in heaven as a great saint. Another characteristic of this virtue is patience, sustaining ourselves in the face of evil. And if you read the story of St. Thomas More, he didn't want to die. He didn't rush to martyrdom. If you read his story, he used every lawyerly trick he could to reformulate the oath in such a way that he could avoid death. Again, we're not suicidal as Christians, But even as he tried, none of his formulations of the oath to the king were satisfactory. But he was tremendously patient, and he persevered through his imprisonment, and indeed holding out for a long time in his clinging to the good. Again, Saint Jose Maria, the founder of Opus Dei, it's interesting. He has a policy in the movement, or whatever it's called. It's not a religious order, but it's because Opus Dei, he was the founder of Opus Dei, it's principally for lay people. But they've got universities and schools and so forth. He would not allow members of Opus Dei to lay a cornerstone for a building. Let's say they were building a new school. He wouldn't allow them to lay a cornerstone, because he said, what we have to do is persevere. So I'll allow you to put in place with a ceremony the capstone. Once the job's done, then we're going to have a nice little ceremony and celebrate what's been done. Okay, so perseverance, holding out. And finally, we've already talked about, in many ways, the relationship of the virtue of fortitude to martyrdom. This is the essential and highest achievement of fortitude. It's a wonder the National Socialists were ever duped for very long at all. They must not have even read the opening words to Pieper's treatise on fortitude. They must have just saw fortitude and thought, this is what our men need on the battlefield, because the opening paragraph in his treatise: fortitude presupposes vulnerability. Without vulnerability, there's no possibility of fortitude. An angel cannot be brave because he is not vulnerable. To be brave actually means to be able to suffer injury. Because man is by nature vulnerable, he can be brave. Right? And then in the very opening section, he brings up martyrdom. Okay? The readiness to shed one's blood for Christ is imposed by the love of God. Okay? So he brings up martyrdom right at the beginning, but that's not the kind of bravery, again, that that government had in mind. I mean, he had, I don't know, you've probably never seen, there was a gathering of leading Nazi officials at a place called Wannsee. There's a documentary that's been made of it called the Wannsee Conference. And they discuss the final solution to the Jewish problem. How many have ever seen that documentary? It's powerful because they see themselves as taking on a great burden to eradicate this race, which endangers humanity and is impeding its full growth and flourishing. And they talk about taking this heavy burden upon themselves and really cast themselves as heroic figures, by taking on this great burden. They never mention exactly what it is that they are going to do because it's unmentionable, really. But they use circumlocutions and they find ways of discussing it with remarkable detail without ever explicitly saying what it is that they are about to do. The Holy Father in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, says what we must do is name the evil. And there he's talking about abortion. We call it anything but the taking of a human life. It's a termination of a pregnancy. The Pope says it's not terminating. He says you're terminating the pregnancy by destroying a life. That's what we have to say. So we avoid the evil. But this pagan heroism did not involve self-immolation, but rather the immolation of the other. And that's not true bravery, not to kill the other. Killing the other isn't true bravery, but a willingness to allow oneself to be killed for the other. And obviously we see it in our Lord, we see it in St. Stephen, the proto-martyr. We see it in Cardinal Mindszenty, who was imprisoned by the communists for 2 decades. We see it in Pope John Paul II, who his whole life has been enduring evil regimes. First of all, there were the Nazis that had taken over Poland, and then they got rid of the Nazis, and the communists came in, and finally that yoke was thrown off. But he's been maligned by the secularists, if you will, of our day, who can't understand what it is that he truly stands for and what it is that he truly advocates. In fact, we live in such a disordered age that, again, these truths can't be seen. I remember being in a drugstore one time, and a Playboy magazine across the top, it said, you couldn't see because they put these boards up, fortunately, in front of them, but it said, a centerfold worth dying for. And I said, this is what you're going to die for? There's some loftier things to die for, than that. But this is the jaded world within which we live. We are, in fact, Father Rutler was here right after 9/11, and as you know, was on the site as the World Trade buildings came down, and saw carnage all around them, and was hearing confessions of firemen before they went running into these burning buildings. And he was recounting this to a young college student that was sitting beside him, and the response of the college student was, how stupid could they be? No sense whatsoever of a willingness to sacrifice one's life for another, and of the great virtue of fortitude with which we are blessed by God's help in terms of perfecting this natural disposition in such a way that it does help us to attain the good. St. Teresa of Avila, I just ran across this the other day, and it made me think of this evening's lecture when St. Teresa writes in her Foundations, "But, O God, what little power has the strongest opposition when thou, Lord, art pleased to bestow courage." Which, thanks be to God, he does. Well, that's the first lecture. Any questions on virtue? Oh, this virtue of fortitude, bravery. Yes?
Yeah, well, I was recently at a talk with Holocaust survivors,
Mm-hmm.
and one brought up an example of speaking with a German who lived across the street from a concentration camp, and the German felt terrible guilt that he hadn't done anything. And the Holocaust survivor said, well, thank God, because now you have your family and you can talk about it, you know. So I'm just wondering, kind of relating it to your idea of just war, you know, how do you weigh, like, when it's appropriate to give everything? Is it the good that can come from it, or, you know?
Well, remember we talked about prudence, of the first of the virtues, and it has to be, in the last analysis, a prudential judgment as to whether or not you're actually going to achieve a good through what you're doing. Pius XII has been criticized for not having denounced more what was going on in Nazi Germany. Of course, I mean, others weren't either. No, in fact, most people didn't know what truly was going on until the war was over. Many Germans themselves didn't truly know what was going on in terms of the final solution. But the Pope had to judge what would most help the Jewish people, and in Holland, the Dutch bishops had issued a very strong. Well, first of all, the Holy See did issue an encyclical, Mit brennende Sorge, with burning sorrow, that denounced National Socialism. But there was an incident in Holland where I think a pastoral letter was read, but there was some public statement on the part of the church against the Nazis, and it led to the response to that, the reprisal for that, the getting even for that, was an acceleration of the Nazis grabbing the Jews and imprisoning them. And so, a prudential judgment had to be made. Well, am I really going to help the situation, or am I going to hurt it by following this course of action? So you really do have to assess all of those. And again, we ought never to seek martyrdom, because that means not the proper kind of disposition. It's a suicidal disposition. But a willingness to never to do evil or to repudiate the good, if it ever comes to that, that you could never denounce your fellow citizen because of his race. And if it meant your life, you'd have to pay with your life, because you wouldn't do the evil. But it might be foolhardy to stand out in front of his house and say, I'm standing here in support of my Jewish friends inside, and then they know where to go find them. So again, prudential judgment has to be used in these cases. Yeah. Yes?
When you were talking about St. Thomas More, I thought of the example of St. Ignatius of Antioch,
Mm-hmm.
and that would be in reference to the section, question 123, where it speaks about the danger of death, and whether it is for pleasure of the body or for the soul. And so St. Ignatius told his companions on his way to Rome, he said, okay, listen to what I'm saying now, but don't listen to me when I'm at the Colosseum just before I'm thrown to the lion's den. So people ask the question as to whether he was suicidal, or whether he was just whether he loved to die for Christ, but it could tell that he was really anxious and that he wasn't about dying.
Well, that's right, yeah. And I think that was the right, proper, and courageous thing on his part. And we know that sometimes it's impossible to endure psychically the physical torment that we might undergo in our bodies. So that what might be coming out of a man's mouth at a time like that obviously is not freely spoken. So to articulate that in a time when one is free and able to do so is the reasonable thing to do, it would seem to me. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for temperance. We're going to talk now about the virtue of temperance, but before I do, I was reminded of a story that I think manifests fortitude. When I studied at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, there was a Cistercian monastery outside of the town called Autrive, and there were a lot of Vietnamese monks at the monastery, and I was over there at the time of the fall of Saigon. I had a very close friend who was one of the monks. His name was Father Albrecht, and one of our children is named for Matthew Albrecht. Of course, I didn't realize at the time that the wicked dwarf in the Nibelungenlied is also called Albrecht. So people want to know why I named my son for a wicked dwarf, but I really didn't. I named him for this monk because Saint Albrecht was one of the three founders of the Cistercian order. But anyway, I was walking down the street in Fribourg with Pater Albrecht, and it was a very rigorous community. I mean, they always wore their habits. They were up at 4 o'clock in the morning to sing matins and celebrate Mass. They had what's called the severe tonsure, where their heads were shaved, and it was just a ring of hair encircling their head. And I was walking along with Pater Albrecht, and I said, well, I guess now that Saigon has fallen, the communists had overrun South Vietnam, were persecuting the church. I said, I guess the Vietnamese monks will have to stay here. Oh, no. He said, they'll have to go back. I said, go back? He says, I said, but it's going to be so dangerous for them. Oh, no, he said, it's far more dangerous for them here. And I said, we're in Switzerland. I said, how can you say it's going to be more dangerous for the monks here in Switzerland than it's going to be in communist Vietnam? And he put out his arm and he stopped me and he said, look, just look. And he pointed across the street to a department store with a big display window and all kinds of nice things in it. And then he pointed to the marquee of a movie theater that had a less than virtuous movie showing, partially clad women on the billboard, and he said, no, it's going to be far more dangerous for them here. They have to go back to Vietnam. I mean, now see, here was a courageous man, but here was a man operating on this level, on the supernatural level. I was operating down here on the human level, worried about them losing their lives, and he was worried about them maybe losing their souls and losing their vocation. So I went back and saw him and took our son Matthew to meet his namesake for the first time a number of years ago. Well, about maybe, how many years? 7 years ago, actually. And we found him in another monastery where he was, actually it was a convent, and he was the chaplain for the Cistercian nuns. And we visited, and I said, by the way, Pater Albrecht, I said, did those Vietnamese monks ever go back to Vietnam? Oh, yes, and we were blessed with martyrs. He said, but this is fortitude, I mean, this is looking to Jesus, and clinging to him at all costs. And this is Jesus on the cross looking to the Father and clinging to him at all costs. So we're going to look now at the final of the cardinal virtues, temperance, which is the lowest, if you will, of the cardinal virtues, because it deals with the disciplining of our most base inclinations and drives and dispositions, those ordered toward food, sex, and drink. And this is traditionally called the concupiscible appetite. Before I reflect on that, though, I want to point out that Pieper, in his treatment of temperance, refers to it as the discipline of selfless self-preservation, which is a very insightful and clever way of succinctly capturing the essence of this virtue. Because the concupiscible appetite, since it's ordered toward food, sex, and drink, is ordered toward self-preservation. I mean, the preservation of the individual, because without food and drink we're going to die. The preservation of the race, because without sex the race will die out. So it's a disposition that is ordered toward self-preservation of the individual and of the species. But the tradition points out, and Pieper sees this with an insight that's marvelous, that we have to do this in a selfless kind of way. The natural tendency is to try to preserve ourselves in a selfish kind of way. You know, I'm going to have enough to eat and drink and wear by hoarding wealth, for example, you know. Or, I've got this sexual appetite and I'm justified in indulging it because I get pleasure out of it. This is a selfish attitude with regard to this disposition. And Pieper points out that unless we're selfless about this appetite, it turns against us and actually is destructive. It destroys us rather than bringing life. And that's the other thing about this particular appetite. It is fundamentally ordered toward life. I mean, food and drink to keep our bodies alive, sex in order to keep the race alive. I mean, sex is all about life. That's its purpose, to engender life. Now, this appetite has been called in the past concupiscible. These are funny words that nobody uses anymore. But a disorder of this is what's referred to as concupiscence. You've probably all heard of concupiscence. Now, and concupiscence is a disorder of our most basic appetites. Now, curiously, the Protestant tradition considers simply the presence of concupiscence to be sinful. Luther, Calvin taught that we are totally depraved, and one of the examples and manifestations of our depravity is our concupiscence. That is, you know, we overeat, we drink too much, we become sexually aroused when we don't want to be. There's a disorder here, and they equate that with sin. I just want to point out to you, we live in a Protestant culture, so if you hear anything about concupiscence, that's what you're going to hear about it. That's not Catholic teaching. Catholic teaching says concupiscence itself is not a sin. It's just a state. It's just a condition that we have. It's a condition which has resulted from original sin. Remember I said, those of you that were here, that Adam and Eve, when they were in the garden, were referred to as being in a state of justice because all of their appetites and inclinations were properly ordered. So it was a beautiful, just order that existed within them. When they sinned, they lost that sense of ordering and hierarchy. Right? And what's the first thing that they get concerned about after sin, after they eat of the fruit of the tree? They get ashamed about what? Their nakedness, their sexuality. I mean, it's the first thing, you know. That's where the fig leaf comes from, you know. We got to cover ourselves up. So you have a disordering of the highest of the virtues because they misread, if you will, reality. They thought that if they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, so here, the intellectual virtue is being disordered. And what happens immediately? The lowest and most base of the virtues, and the one most fundamental for sustaining life, just on the most basic fundamental level, becomes disordered. Okay? This is how all the virtues are related to one another. And we see too, we'll see here that as we act intemperately and without chastity, that our vision becomes clouded. We can no longer see the good so that we're able to act upon it. Now, again, concupiscence in and of itself is not an evil. It comes from original sin, and it leads to sin. Because our passions are disordered and they're hard to keep in control, we're disposed towards sin, but it itself is not sinful. Okay? We're not totally depraved, as some of the Protestants would have us be. Now, this appetite is that by which sensibly pleasing goods are desired. There's the good of truth, but that's not necessarily sensible, right? Because you can do an algebraic problem, but it's not a matter of the senses. This is the appetite ordered toward sensible goods, which are desired, and they ought to be desired. I mean, God wants us to desire them. St. Thomas said, God has put pleasure into the sexual act so that we will seek the sexual act. I mean, otherwise, we're not going to have children. We're not going to keep the human race growing and alive. So, I mean, God's put the pleasure there, but you see, the pleasure is subordinated to what? The good of life. It's not the pleasure is not an end in itself. God puts pleasure in the sexual act so that it will be sought. Why should it be sought? So that it can engender children, so that the race can be perpetuated. Right? Now, here too, we have the problem of excessive desire. The virtue of an appetite has to do with the good use of the appetite. Again, we're using these appetites. We don't suppress them. We don't eradicate them. Continence, for example, that is not using our sexual powers, is not a matter of repressing our sexuality. We get into big problems when we have these God-given natural dispositions and we try to suppress them. But you can't suppress what God's given us. And so what happens is it asserts itself in other places and in a disordered kind of way. We have to find a way of controlling the desire, not eradicating the desire, because there wouldn't even be a virtue there unless there were some desire. Okay? So we're dealing here with a virtue of use and limit. Okay? Now, there was a time in our tradition where there was almost a fear of this natural disposition that God's given us. And this is an old moral theology manual that the seminarians would have used back in the 40s. And it's almost, I would say it's almost an oppressive approach to the moral life. I mean, it's not one that, it's not based on the virtues, for one thing. It's based on commandments and on the law. Okay? And so what they're constantly looking to is what might constitute an infraction of the law. You know? And we read here, there are no children present, so I can, that's the other thing. When all the books used to be in Latin, of course, and when they first started translating theology and morality texts from the Latin so that more of the faithful could benefit from them, when they came to moral theology, which was usually ordered by the commandments, so it was of the first commandment, of the second commandment, of the third commandment. How many commandments are there? 10, right. So they would say of the first, and they would deal with that one, of the second. And you'd be reading along, and when it got to the 6th and 9th commandments, which dealt with human sexuality, it would go back into Latin. It's true, I've got books like that, where you're reading along in English, you get to the 6th and 9th commandment, and it's in Latin. Because back then, people didn't know about many of these things. And the moral theologians would have to deal with very particular and specific sexual acts that they didn't want the lay faithful to even think about, that they didn't want to upset them or have them thinking about things that otherwise they would never have thought about. But it always struck me as curious, because when the Latin for of the sixth and ninth, and this would be the heading of that chapter, reads, de sexto et nono. I mean, I always thought it kind of gave a subtle little message there, de sexto et nono, Anyway, the sixth and ninth commandment. Now, this was taken from one of these texts. It goes on for pages. It is not a sin to look at one's own inciting parts of the body from necessity or utility, as long as there is not evil intention. I'll let you fill in what the inciting parts of your body are. To do this out of levity or curiosity is a venial sin if not done for lust. To look at less inciting parts of one's own body, even without cause, is not sinful as long as one does not do this with the intention of venereal pleasure. To look at a nude person of the same sex out of curiosity is only a venial sin, but if it is done seriously, morosely, and deliberately for a long time with an affection to the looked at body, it is a mortal sin due to the proximate danger of impure sensations or venereal pleasure. To look at less inciting parts of the body of the other sex is not a mortal sin per se, but to do so for a long time may be mortally sinful. It is a mortal sin to look at the inciting parts of the opposite sex even out of curiosity, due to the danger of exciting impure sensations or venereal pleasure. To look at a statue or an image of either sex which is entirely nude without necessity or great utility is usually a grave sin. If the look is serious and prolonged, it is a mortal sin. If this is done only transitorily and briefly without a proportionate cause, there is only a venial sin as long as one does not directly will venereal pleasure. To look at the generating parts of animals from curiosity without any lustful intention or only for a short time is only a venial sin. And it goes on and on and on and on like this. My goodness, you could be almost a frightening way to get through your day. Was it a little too long, or was it, was there some kind of incitement there that I really didn't intend, or did I really intend it? This isn't really what the virtue of chastity is all about. It's an understanding of the goods toward which this appetite is ordered, and it doesn't mean it's a virtue of, as I've just said, of use and limit. You don't pretend that you don't have these natural dispositions, and God gave them to us for a good purpose. It's a matter of using these appetites for a good end. The appetites toward food, sex, and drink. Okay? It's not eradicating it. I was speaking to a university group in Evanston. There must have been about 300-400 students, and it was a debate on abortion, and it was shortly after abortion was legalized in this country, and I was obviously arguing the pro-life position and my opponent the other position. And during the question and answer period, a student put up his hand and said, well, look, he said, if you're opposed to abortion, then surely you must be supportive of the distribution of contraceptives on campus to avoid leading to the situation where you'd need abortion. And I said, no, I wouldn't be in favor of distributing contraceptives on this campus. Well, why not? And I said, because you can't battle one evil with another one. And this is just going to encourage people to engage in immoral activity. And he said, well, what would you propose then? And I said, chastity. And I said one word. I just said chastity. And the auditorium erupted. People started hollering and hooting and shouting and started pelting me on the stage with wads of paper and erasers and pencils. And they stood up on their seats and they were going thumbs down, and pandemonium broke out. It was madness, And it ended the assembly. The place just went nuts. And I only said one word, chastity. One word, that's all I said. So afterwards, I was walking down the hallway with the chancellor of the university, and she's shaking her head like this. And I stopped and I said, yeah, wasn't that incredible? And she looked at me and she says, how do you expect people to live without sex? So she was shaking her head, not at this pandemonium in the assembly hall, but I was saying, I said the word chastity means living without sex. But the thing is, we're going to see here, it doesn't mean living without sex. We can't live without sex because we're sexual beings, It means how we use our sexuality. Because married couples are chaste. I mean, there is such a thing as marital chastity. So people think the word means no use at all. But as we have here with the definition of virtue, this is a virtue of use and limit. Okay? I mean, you use it in the proper way. Okay? We don't try to eradicate it or pretend it's not there. Well, let's look at some of the excesses of this particular virtue. I mean, the excesses would be gluttony, obviously, drunkenness, licentiousness. And there are 3 distinct species of this virtue. And the species means a particular kind of virtue. These are all virtues also, and there's species of the virtue of temperance. One would be abstinence, that is, controlling our consumption of food so that we don't eat too much. Sobriety, so that we drink without going to excess. And marital chastity. Okay? And we don't engage our sexual faculties outside marriage because they're ordered toward children, and if we're not married, we're not going to be able to care adequately for these great goods that God gives us from this activity. And we cannot use it improperly within marriage either. So that to use contraception so as to thwart the natural ends of this activity would be an act of marital inchastity, or lack of unchastity. And this virtue actually helps establish, I have here, a rationality in the person. Because if we don't have this virtue, we become like beasts. We just become brutish very easily, very quickly. I mentioned another class period. We had 2 boxer dogs, Max and Maggie, that my wife thought were in love with one another. But of course they don't, animals don't love, and she always thought they were showing affection to one another. But I would always point out that, Max is licking Maggie's face. My wife said, oh, look, isn't it cute, they're kissing. I said, they're not kissing, she probably has some dog food left on her face. So he's licking it off her face, and then she goes, oh, come here. She says, isn't this cute? Look at them. And they were lying there with their paws entwined, She said, they're snuggling together. And I said, it's cold in the kitchen. This is to get a little more warmth that way, they're animals, sweetie, But, I said, look, if you don't believe me, if you want to see how loving they are to one another, I said, let's get a steak out and throw it in the dish and see if Max steps back and allows Maggie to go first to get the steak. Of course, no way. Max is going to be in there as fast as Maggie. Well, this virtue has to do with our not acting like boxer dogs. With our not being brutish, but rather our stepping back out of a love of a good for someone else and a shared love of the good. And Pieper talks about it as the virtue as a way of integrating ourselves. He writes, without rational self-restraint, even the natural hunger for sense perception or for knowledge can degenerate into a destructive and pathological compulsive greed. So that we have these natural dispositions, but if we don't discipline them, then they turn into vices. He writes, chastity as Temperancia or unchastity as intemperancia. This means that each respectively has become a deep-rooted basic attitude as man and as it were a second nature to him. The virtues are second natures to us. We don't, when they're really in us and settled, we don't think about them. We naturally act in the right way. And when I say naturally, I don't mean like dogs, but I mean like human beings, because it's natural for human beings to act in a rational and ordered way. So that we hardly even think of it. I remember being in a drugstore one time with this priest friend, and I saw a number of these girly magazines, up on the magazine rack. And we left the drugstore, and I turned to this priest friend of mine, and I said, Father, wasn't that disgusting? Wasn't that terrible, all those girly magazines in there? And he went, what girly magazines? Now he was the chaste man, because it was such a settled virtue for him. He didn't even see the magazines. I mean, I was still growing, needing to grow in virtue, because I noticed. Oh, isn't that terrible? Look at that. Oh, that's an awful cover. Oh my goodness, they should, But we don't have the settled virtue there, But when it's second nature to us, when we've become habituated to averting our eyes when we see something that we ought not to be looking at, that's when we're truly virtuous. That's when we're no longer brutish. That's when we're truly acting as human beings. There are, I've talked about potential parts of these virtues. And again, potential parts are human virtues which have something of the full perfection of the virtue we're talking about, but they're technically not temperance. So we can talk about virtues, for example, which are concerned with sensible goods, but which are themselves, these goods are not directly sensibly pleasurable. Okay, so that and they fall under this virtue, like modesty. This is a moderation in dress, and the person who's being modest, in a sense, isn't avoiding, let's say, inappropriate, sensible desires, but the modest person is acting out of a love for the other. And again, you see how this links up to justice right away. So that for a woman to dress inappropriately in clothing that would expose parts of her body that are going to elicit a non-thinking response in the male, that is, he doesn't even have to think about it. We talked about that before. There's a physiological response. For a woman to dress like that is an act of injustice. It's an act of thoughtlessness toward the other person. It's not a loving, it's not a kind deed. She's making the other person's life more difficult. Okay? And usually women don't respond quite the same way to men that men respond to women in these kind of situations. But now, we're in this wonderful enlightened age where women go to bars and watch what are they called? Chipmunks? No, what's it called? Chesapeake? What's it called? Chippendales. Yeah, they go and watch. I knew it was something like that. But anyway, where they now go and, watch men get undressed, or men going around flexing their muscles for the young women. This it's inappropriate. It's a lack of consideration for the other person. Thrift is a virtue that would also fall under temperance in terms of moderation in our possessions, or a reasonable approach to the consumption of food as well. Now, we've already said that virtue, the temperance requires some kind of restraint, right, on our appetite. So we can see that there are some virtues which are related to temperance because it requires some kind of restraint. So if we look, for example, this all the virtues become related. If we look at the irascible appetite, right, which is can flare out in anger, and it may have to be restrained. Well, then it's the virtue of temperance, which is helping us to restrain this irascible appetite. So again, they all work together, so that the righteous indignation is perfectly fine and good. Jesus in the temple, overthrowing the money changers' table. I mean, this was a man that was filled with anger, righteous indignation, righteous anger. I was at one of the bishops' meetings one time, and they were coming out with some kind of document on homosexuality. This was a number of years ago, and the Holy See had said that the homosexual inclination is an inclination toward an objective disorder. Okay, and they had this in the document. Some of the bishops didn't like that because they thought it might hurt the feelings of some homosexuals to be told that they had an inclination toward an objective disorder. So they finally agreed to put it in a footnote. It was a quote from Cardinal Ratzinger, but then some were still uneasy about it even being in a footnote. So they appointed one of the bishops to explain what they really meant in the footnote. And carte blanche, I mean, the bishops go through great procedures before they vote on these documents. They go through all kinds of committees and emendations and so on and so forth. So I saw the final document after the bishop's meeting was over, and when it was talking about inclinations toward objective disorders, it was saying, so homosexuals wouldn't feel bad that they were the only ones. He said, we all have certain inclinations toward objective evils, such as inclination toward anger. And I said, wait a minute, that's wrong. Because there's nothing wrong with the inclination toward anger. I mean, that's the irascible appetite. I mean, if it's properly ordered, it's not an objective disorder the way a man's attraction to another man is an objective disorder, because that can never be ordered right, because two men are not going to join together and engender children, which is the purpose of human sexuality. And it's not easy to try to get something like that corrected in a document, when you're not even a bishop. And I started trying to contact, of course they have different positions within the bishops' conference, and they finish it and then they move on. So the bishop that was head of the committee that had drawn the document up was no longer the head of that committee. Another bishop was now head of that committee, and the former bishop couldn't do anything about it because he was no longer head of the committee, and the new head of the committee couldn't do anything about it because he wasn't head of the committee when it was drawn up. And I thought, this is terrible if it gets out like this, because it's wrong. And fortunately, we were able to get it changed. But I bring that little anecdote up just to say that there's nothing wrong with the disposition toward anger if it's justified and it's properly ordered through restraint, which is of the concupiscible appetite. Now, what about fasting? I mean, some people think that this would be a virtue, but the tradition points out that this isn't actually temperance, fasting. It's another kind of activity. It's not a species of temperance. It's related to a sensible good. That is, fasting is related to food and drink, right? But it's not related to food and drink as we would be guided by the virtue of prudence. The virtue of prudence would say you only eat enough and drink enough to keep you healthy. But fasting says we're not even going to eat enough and drink enough that we normally would to keep us healthy. In other words, we're hungry, we're not going to eat it, but we're not going to eat today. It's Good Friday. So we're not going to eat anything until the evening meal. So it's related to temperance, but it's not temperance, a kind of temperance, because it's it goes beyond what the normal appetite would lead us to do. So that we have to see that fasting is not sought for its own sake, but a means to another end. Okay, now a lot of people, want to lose weight. I can hardly wait for Lent to come, and I'm going to lose 20 pounds, That's not the purpose of Lent, and that's not the purpose of fasting and abstinence. I mean, it's all right to do that, but you're not fasting, you're dieting then, and that's okay. Go ahead and diet, and you can diet during Lent too if you want, but don't call it fasting because it's not fasting. That fasting is done as a means toward another end, but it's a spiritual end, okay, so that we do it for contrition, for our sins. We do it in order to allow our minds to be freer, so that we can contemplate, because we eat too much, we tend to get sluggish. I just saw a show the other day that Americans would probably live generally 10 years longer if they cut their consumption of food right in half. And it has the mind able to be more alert. We can fast to do reparation for our sins and the sins of others. So fasting would be as an act of heroism is to an ordinary act. I mean, this is something above and beyond. Okay? And it's and we don't do it because we enjoy the pain and deprivation. Okay, because I mean, if that's the case, then we're masochists, right? We're not truly acting, not truly fasting, but we enjoy the pain, or we're bulimic or whatever. And the other thing too is that it's ordered toward God, right? Fasting is ordered toward God. Is God a sensible object? No, He's a spirit. So I mean, that's why again it can't be seen as a species of temperance, because God is spirit. He's not of the senses, and this is a virtue of the senses. So we always have to remember, when we're fasting, we always have to remember how good are the things that we're giving up. I mean, it's not a virtuous act if you give up eggplant for Lent and you hate eggplant. I mean, the whole purpose is to give up something that's good, okay? Something that you otherwise would desire, because if that's not the case, then you wind up hating God's creation. I mean, I had a passage, I didn't have time to find it, but from the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu writings, when they tend to be dualists, and they are dualists, and they reject the goodness of the body. And you read the passage, and it almost makes you think of maybe the attitude of a Cistercian monk who is not eating any flesh meat and depriving himself of the body. But for the Hindu, these things are bad, and you don't want to. And in fact, the flesh is bad. Okay, and this leads to a diminution of our physical powers. Whereas we say no, these things are good, and we're giving them up precisely because they are good, not because they're bad. Okay? Otherwise, it wouldn't be virtuous. And in fact, St. Thomas even goes so far as to say that if you fast to the point that your sexual potency has been diminished, you fasted too much. In other words, that's not a good thing. You have to, if you will, fast in moderation. If I can put it like that. Let me say another quote here from Pieper. Yeah. How's this for an Italian? Well, I mean, it was what St. Thomas was, long before there was an Italy, but anyway. If one knowingly abstained from wine to the point of oppressing nature seriously, he would not be free of guilt. I mean, wine's good for you, so you don't want to restrain from it so much that you've oppressed your own human nature. I have differs from Manichaeanism in your outline there. The church has constantly been faced with dualistic heresies. that come under many names. I mean, Gnosticism, Manichaeanism, Catharism, but all of these heresies that have cropped up in the life of the church have had to do with a wrong Christian perception that the body and the things of this world are bad. Okay, and that is not the case among Christians. The same is true with regard to voluntary poverty. I mean, okay, we really should talk about a detachment here, because poverty is virtuous only if it's voluntary. In other words, the poor people on the west side of Philadelphia aren't virtuous just because they don't have. They're not virtuous just because they're poor. But you can have virtuous poor, who are able not to. In fact, I'm making a lot of allusion to this Saint Jose Maria, but he was talking about a Spanish beggar in Madrid who had a spoon, but that's about all he had, and he would use it to eat his meals, but he had this fierce attachment to this particular spoon. And Jose Maria was saying, he's not really free. I mean, he doesn't have this attitude of detachment toward this, because he's bound by something, even if it's a little thing. And again, voluntary poverty is not toward a sensible good, but rather toward an intelligible good. In other words, we are giving up, as the monks do and religious, are giving up possessions, not because there's anything wrong with possessions in and of themselves, but so that they might have more time for the contemplation of God, so that they might be freer of the worries of insuring their goods, for example, that they might be able to give their goods away to others as acts of charity. And then we'll conclude here with looking at celibacy and virginity, which, again, curiously, are not considered to be species of temperance, or a kind of virtue in that sense. You hear these terms misused constantly, constantly. Celibacy simply means being and remaining unmarried, without any particular reference to the past beyond the time at which one has made the decision to be celibate. So, I mean, you might have a celibate who has had sexual experience in the past, for example, but he's made a decision for a lofty and good reason never to marry again. I mean, I've over the years teaching in seminaries, I've had a number of men who are widowers. Their wives have died. They're not virgins. They can't be consecrated virgins, but they become celibates, and they are unmarried and will remain unmarried. And virginity is never having had voluntary, deliberate experience of sensual pleasure. And Thomas talks about this in well, he talks about it in many places, but it's not where I thought it was here. But he talks about both of these states not being a positive good. Now, this gets misunderstood a lot too, because we've got priests who are celibate in the Catholic Church and have to be celibate in order to be priests. We have women who are consecrated virgins, and yet the Church teaches that these aren't good in and of themselves. Celibacy is not a good in and of itself. Consecrated virginity is not a good in and of itself. Well, I should say that, I take that back, consecrated virginity is. Virginity itself is not a good in and of itself. It's simply a negation. St. Augustine, for example, even said the Vestal Virgins were not meritorious, but were rather proud. So there was nothing to be gained simply by being a Vestal Virgin. celibacy, we're talking about virtues or habits, right? Well, is celibacy a habit? No, you don't do anything. It's just a state of affairs that you find yourself in. So celibacy is not virtuous. It's just a state of affairs. It deals with only something to avoid. I mean, by itself, it does nothing to make the possessor good. Celibacy or virginity. Because you can have, the older ones here, when there were a lot more nuns, may remember that, there were could be some pretty nasty nuns, lacking in charity, I mean, my dad was in first grade, and his name was Frank, and the sister always would call him Francis, which would really, he thought that was sissified, so it really upset him. And one day the priest came into the room, and all the children stood, of course, when the priest walked into the room, and my dad jumped up and put up his hand and says, Father, will you tell sister my name's Frank, not Francis? And he said, that nun came over and slapped me across the face, and he said, how was Francis? But he didn't have a particular love for this for this nun. Just being celibate, as we well know, or just being a virgin does not necessarily mean that you're a nice person. And if simply not having sex were virtuous, then that would mean that sex were bad, right? And the church teaches that sex is not bad. The sex is good, and we ought to pursue it and seek it. One of the things we have to realize about celibacy and consecrated virginity is that they're not natural. When people try to rail against the practices of the Catholic Church and they say, celibacy is not natural, and you say, yeah, that's right. It isn't natural. It's very unnatural. It's supernatural. Okay? Our Lord talks about those who become eunuchs, remember? Those who become eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God. The only time celibacy and virginity, consecrated virginity, are good and virtuous is when they're embraced for the sake of the kingdom of God. In other words, when they become a means toward a higher good. Remember, we keep talking all the time about our activities in terms of virtuous activity being ordered toward a good. So celibacy and consecrated virginity set up conditions, are supposed to set up conditions, for an easier practice of the virtues. And if somebody in that state is not practicing the virtues, it's a pointless state. I mean, it's better for them not to be in it. So, since celibacy is only negative, it can't be willed for its own sake. I mean, it's willed for the sake of the kingdom of God. It's willed so that we can be closer to our Lord, spend more time with Him. I mean, that's the whole purpose of this. I remember a priest one time who was celibate in one of the faculties where I was teaching, and he was saying, oh, celibacy is so hard, and it's, I'm alone. And I said, what do you mean you're alone? I said, you're celibate. After dinner, you don't have to go home and help do the dishes and get the kids ready for bed. I mean, you can go to the chapel and you can sit down with our blessed Lord. And I said, you can just be with Him for an hour, 2 hours. I mean, that's a privilege. It's just unbelievable. And he goes, geez, I never thought of that before. You think, well, yeah. Who is his formation director? I mean, but you'd be surprised how many of them just see this as something, they want to be a priest, and so they give this up just so they can be a priest, but they don't see the purposes for which they're giving it up. And consequently, they don't make good use of it. Consecrated celibacy and virginity is to enable these individuals to reach God with a certain ease, okay? And the goods that are normally associated with marriage come to be realized in other ways within the lives of voluntary celibates, so that they gain other children to the children that they're teaching and the children they're caring for in the nurseries or in the orphanages. Yeah, I mean, if a person's a bachelor out of repugnance to children, it's hardly virtuous. Okay, so and the other thing is that it never becomes, since it's not natural, it never truly becomes easy. And so, I mean, a priest always has to be working at the exercise of the other virtues if he's living in a celibate state. Okay, I mean, it's a tremendous requirement for them. And if they get indolent and they get soft, they get easy about it, and they like being a priest because they can go to the country club and they get to tee off first, and they can drive a Buick and they can put the golf clubs in the trunk. I mean, forget the celibacy. They're not living the life that they embrace celibacy for. Okay. So anyway, I hope that maybe has clarified a few things about the nature of these two virtues tonight. So, yes, Joshua.